Now it's time for our keynote speaker, Jahmal Williams. So Jahmal Williams currently serves as the Director of Advocacy for Racial Justice at SJSU. In this position, he is tasked with developing an strategic approach to the university's efforts to address systematic oppression and racial injustice at the institution. Jamal also serves as one of the co-chairs of the Black Leadership Kitchen Cabinet of Silicon Valley. The BLKC has been working tirelessly on behalf of Black residents within the Valley for over 15 years, advocating and collaborating with local and county leadership to ensure that the Black community is being served equitably. Jamal formerly worked as a program director of the Black Leadership and Opportunity Center, BLOC, and as one of the assistant directors at Peer Connections, all within San Jose State University. He is a native of the Metro Detroit area in Michigan and came to SJSU almost 7 years ago, after spending over 3 years at North Carolina Central University in Durham, North Carolina, working with their Minority Male Retention Initiative and as a licensed therapist in their counseling center. He attended the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, where he earned a bachelor's degree in women's studies in 2005 and a master's degree in clinical social work in 2007 from Michigan State University. Even though working in higher education has been his calling, Jamal knows his true passion is working towards a true equity for Black lives in this country in all that he does. He hopes to inspire change through his actions, words, and empathy. Jamal is inspired by the love and support he gets from his family and friends. His wife, Regina, is a constant source of motivation as she works to develop low-income and homeless housing for the South Bay area. Jamal and his wife have learned how to successfully take orders from their two daughters, Noelle, age 5, and Cori, age 1, who consistently keep them on their toes. Thank you very much, Jamal Will.
Thank you so much, Brian, for that introduction and everybody for this conference. Props to you all for doing this, and I'm honored to be here. So I'll start with, before I continue, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the tribal land that I stand on here in San Jose of the Ohlone Nation, and how their sacred land was viciously stolen away from them. We must all strive to be good stewards of their land and do the work to figure out how to return what is rightfully theirs. I also want to take a moment to pause to acknowledge all of the lives we have lost to state-sanctioned violence. I honor George Floyd and Breonna Taylor as national catalysts for an entire world movement, but through lynchings, death penalty, war, and police violence, we have lost many lives. I stand in solidarity with the fight for Black lives and truly believe that when all Black lives matter, then all lives will matter. But I fight for all oppressed, enslaved, and persecuted communities in this country. I pause to give honor to all of these lives senselessly taken before their time. I have to say that I'm honored to be delivering today's keynote address for this conference. And to be honest, when Jonathan reached out to me and asked me to speak for 30 minutes, I was both excited and confused. The excitement came from the fact that I would be able to share some thoughts, information, insight, and wisdom with not only a group of SJSU graduate students that represent the next generation of activists, leaders, and change agents for our country and world, but also a virtual community that spans genders, ethnicities, professions, religions, classes, and abilities. I'm excited because as a Black person and as someone who has dedicated his personal and professional life to racial justice, I applaud the Spanish graduate students and the Department of World Languages and Literature for putting on such a timely conference with such a powerful message. But I'm also confused because my partner always tells me that no one really wants to listen to hear me talk for 30 minutes straight. But here I am, so the joke's on her. The time of this pandemic has changed everyone's lives in so many ways that we can't even count. It has illuminated aspects of our society that we didn't know existed, and many that were lying dormant, and some that were always alive and well, but were easy to ignore. We saw a president spew hate, racism, misogyny, and xenophobia in attempts to further ignite white supremacy and harken our country back to the days of Jim Crow. We saw a country conveniently forget that we were in the midst of a deadly pandemic once they realized that the most deadly virus in the last 100 years was disproportionately killing Black and brown lives. We were introduced to the term essential worker while simultaneously learning that an essential worker's life is routinely undervalued, underpaid, and anything but essential. Many of our essential workers were stuck working long hours, having to subject themselves to health risks, all while working jobs that didn't provide insurance. We saw a violent insurrection of the United States Capitol building in an effort to overthrow a legally upheld election. The insurrectionists proceeded with no regard for laws, decency, or frankly, humanity, as the same people who routinely shouted Blue Lives Matter during protests against oppression and assault on Black lives callously beat and murdered the same police officers they claim to care about. We saw law enforcement respond with a general sense of restraint towards the violent, mostly white insurrectionists, something rarely, if ever, extended toward Black people in much more tame and routine situations. We saw the impact of spewing anti-Asian rhetoric for the greater part of a year result in heinous and devastating hate crimes and mass murders. And I acknowledge that this racist hate speech fueled by our former president has impacted all races and cultures. We've seen in Oakland and San Francisco that Black people have also perpetuated violence against Asian populations. But I share that to illuminate that white supremacy has continued to take its toll on all of us, and we must actively fight it or we succumb to it. For almost 2 centuries, while white supremacy was massacring Black people and decimating our neighborhoods, some Asian communities, while not facing their own oppression, were allowed to construct vibrant communities that we see thriving today. White supremacy used Black people as the villain and Asian people as the model, pitting our communities against each other. Remnants of this past still exist. All of this is used as a tool to center whiteness and other everything else and everyone else. We must continue to reject the internal fighting from communities of color to withstand the forces of white supremacy. And lastly, we saw that the fight for equality and freedom is still going. When in early 2020, we had to witness a string of murders and assaults on Black lives, from Ahmaud Arbery to Breonna Taylor, to Daniel Prude, to George Floyd, to Rayshard Brooks, to Jacob Blake, to more recently Dante Wright, to Ma'Khia Bryant and Andrew Brown, we were reminded that not only does this country not value Blackness or Black lives, but it really doesn't value life at all. We saw armed officers beat, tear gas, and harass peaceful protesters throughout cities across this country. We were reminded that upholding systems of oppression is more important to our government and leadership than making meaningful change. But what we also learned during this pandemic is that the structure of this country that we have held for so long is fragile. And that while many are desperately fighting to rebuild and maintain systems of tyranny and oppression that have existed forever, the voices of the frequently voiceless have begun to rise up, bellow out in unison that this country is and has always been broken, that our systems are steeped in white supremacy that perpetuates systemic racism throughout all aspects of our country, that taking the bare minimum for ourselves while billionaires and corporations extract all resources from workers isn't how we choose to live anymore, that everyone deserves the opportunity to vote, that science and our climate crisis are real, that we recognize that our criminal justice system is profiting off the extinction of Black and brown lives, and that we won't put up with it anymore. We learn the true power of our voices and what we must do, not to preserve our country as it was pre-pandemic, but to reimagine and rebuild it to what it needs to be and what it should be. I titled my speech, Ensuring a Voice for the Voiceless, because I believe that what we are seeing with this racial reckoning across the country, and frankly across the world, are populations whose voices gone unheard, ignored, and dismissed are yelling out. And if Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. told us, that if protest is the language of the unheard, then this past year is a reflection that all unheard voices are speaking out in the same language in unison. It is the voices of the oppressed on social media, television, and in person saying that enough is enough. It is the voice of people like Stacey Abrams galvanizing all of Georgia to vote like their lives depended on it, because they literally did. And it is our voices now that will sustain this fight to ensure change for decades to come. When I think about where I found my voice in this fight for equity and racial justice, I think back to my own upbringing as one of 3 sons of John and Karen Williams. My father passed away when I was 6 years old from brain cancer, and my mom struggled to raise 3 Black boys during the 80s and 90s, which, if you don't know what that means, it means raising kids during the war on drugs, during the Reagan era, during DARE, and during This Is Your Brain on Drugs. She also raised us during an era of respectability politics and affirmative action. So what does that mean? Well, my mother was raised during the civil rights era. It was where she found her voice. The fight for equality in the 1950s and 60s led to clear wins, the Civil Rights Acts of 1964, 65, amongst others. What happened after was an opening up for Black people into certain spaces that were off limits before, like companies, boardrooms, government, police, and other industry. And while this sounds good, the results led to the right type of Black person finding the doors open to those spaces. It's led to a generation of Black parents trying to raise their kids the right way. And we know this way to include all of the coded language of white supremacy, such as being professional, dressing appropriately, having good hair, and being well-spoken. So think about it this way. We have a generation of parents like my mother who just recently received the right to vote, the right to sit at the front of the bus, the right to eat at any restaurant they want, and the right to buy property in any neighborhood they see fit, but only with the stipulation that they are always appropriate. Then we also see a steep increase in an all-out assault on Black people through mass incarceration by the tens of thousands. And because of policies from decades before where Black people were funneled into substandard housing through redlining, housing covenants, and other racist policies, through the omission of all resources of those neighborhoods, and a systematized flooding of guns and drugs into these same historically ignored communities, how is a parent supposed to keep their children safe? And how does a parent give that child voice? Well, they do it through struggle, through resistance, and by giving everything they have. My mom used her voice, which was fairly quiet in the larger equation, so that my voice and my brother's voices would be heard by the thousands. She told us that our father didn't die and we didn't struggle for no reason. We were to learn from this, and not just to do better for our own families, but to make life better for everyone that we have the opportunity to touch. See, I used to resent my childhood. We grew up broke. We didn't have much, and we always seemed to be struggling. I thought if my mom just worked harder, we could have more and we'd be in a better situation. It wasn't until I realized that fighting through racism and white supremacy in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and the war on Black lives and other lives of color, which started in the 1980s and still continues today, is actually traumatic. And just making it to see 2021 is a testament of strength, resilience, and fight. My voice comes from recognizing that I owe it to my mother and father and my grandparents who spent their childhoods under Jim Crow. I owe it to my children to continue this fight that they all started. My voice exists because of all of them, and I am only the sum of all their parts. I was able to attend the University of Michigan during the Supreme Court case of Gratz v. Bollinger, in which Jennifer Gratz sued the University of Michigan, stating that she wasn't admitted, but other less qualified Black students were solely based on their race. Imagine that scene, a Black man at an institution that's 70% white. We as Black students had to use our voice not only to legitimize our own experience, our own existence, but also to say, look, don't mess with us. Because while we want to be here and learn and get our degrees, we're all still from the hood. We had to simultaneously reject racist stereotypes and expectations while trying to be non-threatening and acceptable to whiteness. It's honestly enough to drive you mad. And that's what happened. We got mad, we marched, we rallied, we built, we spoke out. I didn't realize how much of a catalyst this would be for the rest of my professional journey. But looking back, I know this moment set the stage for my entire future. The University of Michigan experience I had taught me how amazing it was to be Black and how much responsibility I had to ensure the health and success of my community. I've devoted my professional voice and my community voice to working towards true freedom and liberation of Black people. And after moving to California, not only did that work crystallize, but I also was able to truly experience and understand the intersections of Blackness with our PITA, Chicanx, Latinx, and Native and Indigenous communities. I recognized how powerful our collective voice is to implement true change, but was also confronted with the complexities of overcoming converging and diverging histories and differences shaped by white supremacy. The struggle of building this shared fight to dismantle systemic oppression that plagues us all is where our work lies. And seeing the resistance and resilience of all communities in this current civil rights movement is what gives me hope. It is what energizes me to keep going, and my hope is that it will ignite a fire in you that will propel you to continue to make necessary change for us in this world and for the world to thrive. When we think about the issues that were uncovered by this pandemic and this civil rights movement for racial reconciliation, we have unearthed a number of challenges. We have Republican-led legislators working hard to overturn voting rights and make what should be a right for all citizens harder for people, which we know has disproportionate effects on low income and communities of color. Additionally, these same Republican legislators, instead of thinking about how to end the death penalty, are thinking of ways to extend it by adding firing squads. South Carolina is planning to join Oklahoma, Mississippi, and Utah as the only states that will legally allow execution by firing squad. And honestly, I mean, WTF, right? We see an organized attempt to disallow schools from teaching true histories of slavery and Native genocides. During the pandemic, billionaires got 54% or $4 trillion richer, while 4 out of 10 people in this country are still experiencing economic hardship. And worldwide, the number of people living in poverty doubled from 250 million to 500 million. And did you all know that just 2% of the $4 trillion that billionaires got during the pandemic would end homelessness and improve public education for every person in this country? 2%. Police have killed 292 people in 21 already. Our police kill the same number of people in a month that some countries kill over the course of 2 years. Police spending nationwide has increased from $42 billion in 1977 to $115 billion in 2020. And San Jose spends $450 million on policing, which is 44% of the city's budget. Interestingly enough, as a country, we spend more on policing than every country except China spends on their entire worldwide military. We've seen immigrant children and their families locked in cages at our border, while our country's leadership fails to create a comprehensive plan for citizenship and instead spends billions on constructing a wall and militarizing our nation to extract resources from these same countries that these individuals and families are migrating from. We've seen healthcare spending drastically increase, while insurance companies and medical companies are continuing to raise their profits. We know that wealth gaps between white populations and Black and Brown and Indigenous populations are severely disparate. We know that Black maternal health rates in the US compare only to those of some of the lowest resource countries, as Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to suffer a pregnancy-related death than white women. We know there is a real climate crisis, and as our earth warms and our resources are being depleted, that will have a major impact on communities of color and low-income neighborhoods. We aren't blind to the facts anymore. For those of us who live in San Jose, we see the racial disparities, and we recognize that this type of untamed capitalism that we have been employing here for years only exacerbates the inequalities that span racial and economic lines. The calls for a new Green Deal socialist principles that include massive taxes on the wealthy who almost never pay their fair share, universal health care, something that almost all major industrialized nations have employed, except for the US, are growing louder and louder. People recognize that our education system is unjust and unequal only because we have commodified education instead of making it a human right. It has turned into a capitalist game between the have and the have-nots to see who gets access to the best education and resources. And then somehow they convince us that they worked harder and deserve to hoard all of the resources they collected. We see that lie for what it has been and always been. See, the civil rights movement, which exploded last year, has lifted the veil to uncover the dark truths about this country. It has opened our eyes as a country, and the people don't like what they see. This is why we speak up, and this is why our voices are and need to be as vociferous and powerful as they can be. So where do we go and what do we do? Well, first, we have to recognize that our individual voice exists as part of a collective voice. We all have a role to play to make change, but part of our role is first committing to the changes we want to see. I know that some of these aspects of fixing racial and social injustice seem impossible and far-fetched, but think about it this way. My grandmother was born in 1934. It took her 30 years before she had some semblance of equal rights. So I'm sure when she was 15, when she was 20, the thought of equal rights for Black Americans seemed as impossible as it does now to pass universal health care, or to enact stricter gun laws, or to provide reparations for slavery for Black Americans. And you know how the national conversation makes defund the police out to be some wild socialist anarchist fantasy? Well, we just saw San Francisco defund their police by $4 million to give that money to support Black businesses and industry. We've seen defunding in LA, Denver, Minneapolis, Oakland, Baltimore, New York, Austin, Texas, and Seattle. What exists as only a pipe dream for decades eventually can become a reality when collective voice and action gain momentum and never relent. So as graduate students in the next generation of leaders, innovators, legislators, and community change agents, your voice has never been more powerful and had more potential than it does now. So I have a few takeaways as to how you can use that voice to impact change now and continually. Get involved locally. Wherever you live, there will be a cause. There will be systemic injustice, and there will be active entities fighting those injustices. I currently co-chair the Black Leadership Kitchen Cabinet, a coalition building organization. And after about a year of volunteering my time to meetings and committees, I was asked to be the co-chair. We met with school boards to get police officers removed from schools. We met with county supervisors to advocate money be allocated for Black maternal health, as well as towards education enrichment. And we are currently working with other orgs to overhaul community safety and policing in this city and county. Organizations like this are ready and waiting all over the state for people like you. They're ready and waiting just for the skills you can bring and whatever time you have to offer. Even if just for the first year, you just go and listen, just being present and aware can spark something bigger in you. Also, support legislation for change and vote when the time arises. There is so much movement happening politically that most people are unaware in our day-to-day until after it's passed. I never really considered myself politically savvy until I moved to San Jose and wanted to make change for my community. And once I did, I saw that the city council and county supervisors decide so much stuff at the local level. And assembly members and state senators have power on the state level. Find your niche and make your voice heard. That can be through letter writing, calling in the city council meetings, attending open forum sessions, and working in collaboration with community. Your voice can go a long way to enacting change. We elect these people. They're supposed to work for the betterment of all our lives. If they aren't doing that, we must replace them with people who will. Wherever you work, know that you can fight for change. Oftentimes, we separate fighting for change and making money. We don't have to bifurcate passion and income anymore. Every industry is facing some social justice and racial justice issue. Equity for BIPOC populations isn't anywhere close to being actualized, so there's a ton of room for work. No matter what job you get, you can always be an agent of change and progress. If you're going into tech, you can be instrumental in ensuring that the products and services are centered in equity and instrumental in ensuring that all populations, especially low-income populations, have access to these opportunities. If you're working in education or healthcare, it is almost guaranteed that Black and Brown populations aren't receiving equitable services. And in almost every aspect, thinking about how to turn your company from a homogenous or even a diverse space into an anti-racist space takes real time, thought, and effort. You can always be part of these conversations. You can center your work on these efforts. And honestly, we need you to do that. And lastly, give yourself some grace and patience. Come to learn the phrase, don't try to boil the ocean. This is a slow burn. And while some results may be immediate, most are painstaking, arduous, and only result after difficult fights and devastating circumstances. For instance, the Minnesota City Council instantly defunded their police after George Floyd was murdered. Contrast that with the city of San Jose, who we've been fighting with for the better part of 12 months now. It might take a current high-profile mistake or murder for our city to finally capitulate. We don't want that, and as community members, we are taking a proactive approach. But change is hard, and so many oppositional forces such as white supremacy, capitalism, racism, and classism want to maintain the status quo. At the end of the day, we do the best we can. We take it slow, we take care of ourselves, we convene with friends and family, we make meaning of the little things in our lives, we read stories to our children, we work in our gardens, we laugh, we cry, we Netflix and chill, we exercise, we study, we read, we write, then we go back in the trenches to fight for more change. We don't give up. We know that we're blessed with our voice and that many before us didn't have or had, but could never amplify. Our collective voice is power. We are meant to write, blog, tweet, YouTube, broadcast, call out, interject, protest, and scream out that enough is enough. And from this point forward and forevermore, we refuse for our voices to ever be silent again. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamal Williams, for such a wonderful and inspiring speech. The Spanish graduate, students, and faculty appreciate and honor your efforts for fighting for racial equity. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Thank
Now,
you for having me.
thank you very much. Now we open the conference for questions. Please feel free to include your questions in the chat. We have many questions, so. Okay, so I would like to ask you this question. So how, mm, okay, so what is your advice for SJSU students and faculty in regards to racial equity? What can we do to improve our campus in regards to diversity and racial equity?
Yeah, great question. And to be honest, I do see, in my role now, I see the campus trying. I see the campus actively putting racial equity as a priority. And at the same time, we need to be constantly held accountable. The administration needs to consistently be held accountable, needs to hear your voice, needs to know what students want, right? So I talked about voice. Students, faculty, and staff have to continue to use their voice and say, hey, we asked for this. Where does this stand? And that's okay. And we should be able to answer that. And even if the answer is we're working on it or it's taking more time, we should be able to say that, right? But what everybody else can do is one, come together around some causes that speak to community or speak to the departments. Specifically though, two, this is where the effort and time comes in, but it always helps to show up with a plan crafted out as opposed to showing up and throwing it at administration, because that's going to take a longer time. Because now we got to craft a plan, which means if we're doing it equitably, we got to go back and say, what was it that, how did we don't want to just make the decisions, right? So if we do that, then it's top down, it's not community centric. That's the wrong approach, right? So if there are aspects of a plan that say, hey, this is what equity looks like for us, this is what improvement looks like for our department, our area, our race, our culture, so on and so forth. Here are some details. And then when we get that, that's where the accountability comes in and says, yo, I know we gave you a plan. We did this with the city. A lot of our organizations created the Black Agenda. And it took us a while to craft this thing, and it still could be even better, curated. But we gave it to the city, and we go back to the city. It's been months. We keep going back, and now they're finally, and we know the process is long, but they're finally saying, okay, we're reviewing this more thoroughly. We have some questions. So, but if we had just gone and been like, hey, we want this, they would never work on that. And that's just part of how it goes with such a large institution like San Jose State. But if you come with the specifics, then you can say we asked for A, B, and C. Because then when something happens, you can say, yo, we already asked about that. We already have the solutions written up about that. So it's unacceptable that you haven't addressed that. Right? So that's what I would say. Hold us accountable. Come with some concrete plans. First, organize yourselves so that you can make those plans. Just as specific and detailed as much as you can.
Thank you very much. So that's true. So we as students, we have a lot of power in the university and we have to show that. Thank you.
Yes. Yes.
Now we have a question from Dr. Fernandez. So she says, could you please describe how you role at SJSU a bit more and how it connects with SJSU's efforts towards equity?
Yeah. So my role, I kind of put it into three different buckets. It's brand new. Anybody who's been the first person in that job knows how challenging it is to create a role as you're doing it. So it takes time. But the way I look at it is one, consulting with faculty, staff, and departments around what anti-racism and equity and racial justice look like for those areas. As you may imagine, not everybody just knows what being anti-racist looks like. People don't always know how it actualizes itself within a department or within a college. And so my job is to assist with that, offer some suggestions and solutions. I don't do training. Our Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion does most of the training, but I'm more of like, let's say like a consultant, like an anti-racism consultant for our campus. That's one. Two, creating specific initiatives and programs that will drive efforts of racial justice and equity. So, I have the pleasure of working with Vanessa. One of my ideas was to do a racial justice conference, but a citywide racial justice conference where we as San Jose State lead the conversation on what being anti-racist and providing racial justice looks like. So we would envision programming all over the country, all over the city, all over the area, and not just San Jose State programming, but nonprofits would do programming, churches, high schools, community colleges, and so on. And Vanessa's on our committee. So that's one initiative and an idea I had come with, but also we're thinking about how do we restart pre-college programs? So TRIO programs like Upward Bound, summer programming, where we know we have students in our community. We have young students, middle school, high school, that could throw a rock and hit San Jose State, but they've never been on our campus. They don't feel a connection to our institution. And until we make a real commitment to say that we're not going to just extract resources from San Jose, we're going to build San Jose. We're going to make an impact in the communities that are very much overlooked. And we're not doing our job as an institution. So what kind of initiatives can I create? And the third bucket ties into that. What kind of partnerships can we create? We have a ton of resources on our campus, a ton. I know it doesn't feel like it all the time, but if you drive down the street to some of our neighborhoods in San Jose, and then you come to our campus, you'll realize it's like paradise. It's like paradise on our campus, right? Like I grew up in the hood. I don't know how many of y'all grew up in the hood, where you take the hood and you go to a college, it's two different worlds. The resources on our college, yes, they're here for students, but we're not just taking up, well, first one on stolen land, we're taking up space in the city, and we're still extracting the resources. We're extracting money from the city, time, effort. We owe it to our populations to say, here is not just a pathway to come to San Jose State, but we got these tennis courts sitting right in the middle of your neighborhood. You can use them. We have this big old aquatic center. Yeah, it's for our students, but it's for y'all too. Some of y'all may not know how to swim or don't even have access to pools, right? We have to get out of this mentality, again, of the haves and the have-nots, that education is this open door to some shiny thing, when we are a public school on public land using public money, we should have more of our stuff should be public. Now it gets tricky because students like to complain, well, I'm paying tuition for this. Why do I want my tuition to go? Well, we got to stop being so selfish too. Like, stop it. Yeah, if y'all go and work at schools, help these students understand, stop being so selfish, because all that does is close the doors to our campuses for the people who see the school but don't feel like they have access to it. And I've worked at a private school before on a hill, Georgetown University. The black kids in Southeast DC didn't even think about Georgetown. They didn't even think about it. They didn't even try to go there because it didn't feel open. And we know people in San Jose feel the same way about San Jose State, and that's our fault. So that's my job. That's what I'm trying to do, those three things. That's how hopefully I can advance racial justice and equity.
I have a question, Jahmal.
Yeah, sure.
What would you say, or what would you recommend, like when people or like students or any people like encounter issues or racial problems like on the streets, like just walk away, like, or how to deal with those kind of problems, because sometimes you come out with comments or stuff like it bothers you, but like educate before like approaching those problems, or just walking away from them.
Right. So this is going to be an individual kind of answer. You know, if it's a microaggression, right? Like somebody walking up to me and asking me something like, yo, do I know where the weed is at? And like, I don't smoke at all, but the perception is like, I do because I have long dreadlocks and I'm Black. Like that's a microaggression. That's based on stereotypes. I might be like, yo, why'd you ask me that? Right? Like, was it because of how I look? You should stop. Or if someone asks to touch my hair when I'm out, don't do that. I don't want you touching my, why? No. So I might take a moment to be like, don't do that. Right. Or you do know that's racial. Like that's racial. But if it's aggressive, you know, I would recommend people walking away, right? Because that's a lose-lose situation. But in all aspects, the biggest recommendation is taking care of yourself, right? Because in the moment, sometimes you just want to get out that moment, right? It's not your job to educate in the moment. It's not your job to fight unless you're actually protecting yourself, right? But your biggest job is to take care of yourself. And then gear up, how do I make sure this doesn't happen for other people? And you won't always, you know, win every battle. Like I can't stop people from asking me to touch my hair or like, you know, little things I get, even as a father, you know, I'll get people saying, oh, you're babysitting today. I'm like, these are my kids. I don't babysit my own kids. It's called parenting, right? Like you can't stop microaggressions from happening, but I can talk about it with people I love. I can go to counseling to process what's happening. I can find my network of people who understand this nonsense, and we can debrief it and just come together to talk about how we feel, what we want to see, you know, positive stuff that has nothing to do with race and racism. And so that's where the work lies. And then seeing, okay, what can I do in the space that I have right now to make sure that I can protect my community from this again, right? And it might not be much. Maybe it's just going to a protest. Maybe it's supporting a bill. Like I said, it's finding that space. But in the moment, the goal is to take care of yourself. It has to be. And if you're around people and you have your family there, like if I'm with my daughters and somebody, like my goal is to take care of my daughters. But I don't expect people to necessarily fight in the moment or educate. Like, you know, that's not on you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have one question. Like, how will you represent a community like correctly without taking appropriation of their culture or like being offensive towards them? So how do you know how to advocate like in a proper way for them? Does that make sense?
No, it makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense. You know, as a Black person, I can readily advocate for the Black community, but how do I actively advocate properly for our Native and Indigenous population or our Chicanx Latinx population? I mean, you know, it starts with talking to those communities. You know, I look at my role as someone who has access to the leadership of our institution, to the president. I don't look at my role as the person who's supposed to know everything, because I can't. And so my job is to go back to some of my old colleagues. I don't know if you all have had the opportunity to meet Lily Pinedo Gangay at El Centro, but you know, like I remember when she started, she's my homie. I would go to her and say, yo, where are we falling short? How can I use my seat and my voice to advocate for what it is you and the community you represent and are part of need? And that's the only answer, you know, and then opening up the door so that it's not me taking Lily's words or Vanessa's words or anybody's words and bringing them back to the president. And that's going to happen sometimes because we can't, every meeting with the president's cabinet can't have 90 people in it. Nothing will get done, right? So you do sometimes need just that one person to hear and bring back. But it's also cool for me to say, hey, Lily, I set up this time for you to say what needs to happen. Can you make it this time? Like, does this work? You know, so So that's really how I see my role, and that's what an advocate does, right? An advocate fights for people because they have access to different things, but an advocate doesn't do everything for people, right? They create open door, they create spaces for people, they create opportunities, and so that's how I see it. I mean, I do a lot of listening, and only being able to represent one racial community, but having the job of representing multiple, I have to go reach out to multiple, right? I have to talk to multiple. I don't want to make decisions. Now, sometimes I do take liberties. For instance, a lot of the conversation around, there was this API does the American Task Force, was working on, they have a task force to look at how to create a student center. And I would routinely say, and this is a liberty I'm taking, but I'm thinking about it from the space of being a Black person. They wanted a center. And I'm like, well, the campus is 44% Asian. A center is not enough, right? A center is actually not enough. And I'm not trying to tell a community what they should want. At the same time, speaking on behalf of a Black person and having worked at a historically Black institution, I know if we had a school that was half Black and the school itself didn't represent Blackness, we would be pissed if they tried to give us a center, right? Like, we'd be mad. Like, no, look around. Like, no, this isn't, not in 2021. Maybe in 1970 we wouldn't be as mad, but right now we wouldn't stand for it. And I want to share that. I don't want to appropriate. I can't do it, but I do tell my colleagues in the leadership. I'm saying, look, if we're setting at a center, if this is all we can think of when we represent 45% of this population are our students, we are failing them and we're being disrespectful. So I do that sometimes, but that's less about my job and that's more about who I am as Jahmal Williams. I'm kind of gregarious. I speak my mind, and people either like it or don't. And so yeah. But I advocate, and so I reach out and I talk. Sorry, I got into that one a little bit. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Jahmal. And last question. So, Jahmal, are you in the process of writing a book, future projects you are working on?
I've toyed with the idea of writing a book, man. It takes so much time. I got 2 kids. This stuff is hard. I blog a little bit. I think, I blog for 2 websites. One of my passions is the intersections of race and society and sports. I love sports. I play sports. So I blog for one of my friend's websites. He works for ESPN, but someone else runs it now. So I blog for his site. My sister-in-law has a site dedicated to like Blackness and centered around Black women. And with 2 daughters and a wife, and I was a women's studies major in college. That's something that I want to make sure I'm constantly focused on the experience that my daughters face. So I don't think I'll write a book. That just feels like a lot. I want to, but it's just such a commitment, and I've never done it before. But I think I give so much of my time. So when I'm not with family, we have so much happening in this city and in this county to advocate for Black people. We have a coalition. Our BLKC is a coalition, but we also have a coalition of nonprofits and organizations that represent all people. We call it the racial equity. What's the A stand for? Something leaders. We call it REAL. It's a whole network, like Sacred Heart and Aki, and it's a bunch of us. We meet every Thursday to talk about what's happening. I've co-chaired this Black Democratic Club so that we have a vote with assembly members. I'm a vice president from one of the other leaders who runs an organization. Like, there's a lot popping off outside of work. And sometimes I don't remember what is and isn't work. When I'm meeting with like the county supervisors at 2 p.m. when I'm supposed to be working. But it all comes together in the end because I think it all makes our campus and our city better. that's my time. And when I'm not working, I'm kind of working for community, and then just, kids and family. That's what I got. So, well, maybe a book might come someday, but I'll still blog in the meantime. Appreciate that question.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Jahmal. We will be looking forward. Again, thank you, Jahmal Williams, for being our keynote speaker. I am confident that you have created an enormous impact on every person attending this event. There are no words to express our gratitude. Thank you very much for being our keynote speaker.
Thanks for having me. This was dope, and I appreciate the love, and I'm so glad y'all did this. If you ever need help in the future, please reach out to me, and hopefully in the future we can connect this more to the city, to the county, and we can make this bigger. I think once we do our conference in November, we'll be able to see just how many inroads we have to community, because you could have high school students on this, and it can be big. So let's keep talking. Thank you all so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Jahmal.
Take care.
Thank you.